The wind cut across the pavement like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. And Daniel stood there, with his daughter's small hand gripped tightly. In his, both of them shivering on the curb outside the apartment building where they'd lived for the past 8 months. Except it wasn't their home anymore. Hadn't been for the last 3 hours since Rebecca had screamed at him to get out, had thrown his clothes into a duffel bag and tossed it down the stairs, had told him he was worthless, that she was done, that she'd found someone better, someone who could actually provide. And when he'd asked about Maya, about their daughter, Rebecca had laughed this cold, cruel laugh and said Maya could stay or go. She didn't care anymore. She was tired of playing mother to a kid who wasn't even planned. And Daniel had looked at his daughter's face, at the confusion, fear in those wide brown eyes, and he'd made the only choice could make, had picked up Maya and the duffel bag and walked out into the November evening that was turning colder by the minute. Before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Maya pressed against his leg now, her thin jacket doing almost nothing against the wind, and Daniel looked down at her and tried to smile, tried to make his face show confidence instead of the terror that was churning in his stomach, because he had $43 in his wallet, no credit cards that weren't maxed out, no family within 300 miles, no friends who had space for a man and a child, with nowhere else to go when night was falling fast, the sky turning that particular shade of purple-gray that meant real darkness. What was coming, and he had no idea what to do next, no plan beyond getting Maya somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere that wasn't this sidewalk where cars passed, without slowing, where people walked by and looked away quickly, not wanting to see, not wanting to acknowledge the small disaster unfolding in front of them. Daniel was 26 years old, but felt about 60 in that moment. Felt every mistake he'd ever made pressing down on his shoulders like physical weight. And the worst part wasn't even the cold or the fear. The worst part was the shame, the burning acidic shame of having failed his daughter, of not being able to provide the one thing she needed, most which was stability, safety, a place to lay her head that wasn't contingent on someone else's mood or mercy. He'd met Rebecca 3 years ago when he was working construction, and she was waitressing at the diner where he ate lunch most days, and she'd been beautiful and funny, and he'd fallen fast and hard. And when she got pregnant, 6 months later, they'd moved in together, even though his mother had warned him, had said Rebecca had a mean streak, had said Daniel needed to be careful, but he'd been young and in love and stupid, and he'd ignored all the warning signs, the way Rebecca talked about other people, casual cruelty in her jokes, the way she'd turn cold when she didn't get what she wanted. And by the time Maya was born, and he saw clearly who Rebecca really was, it was too late. They were tied together by this tiny, perfect person who deserved better than both of them. And Daniel had tried. God, he'd tried, had worked overtime, had swallowed his pride, had accepted Rebecca's moods and manipulations, because he thought that's what you did. You made it work for the kid. Except making it work had slowly destroyed him, had worn him down to nothing. And now here they were, him and Maya, standing on a sidewalk with everything they owned in one bag. Maya looked up at him with those eyes that saw too much, that understood more than any 5-year-old should have to understand, and she said quietly, "Daddy, where are we going to sleep?" The question hit him like a fist to the chest, because he didn't know, didn't have an answer, and he couldn't lie to her, had never been able to lie to her. So he said, "I don't know yet, baby, but we'll figure it out. I promise we'll figure it out." And she nodded like she believed him, even though he barely believed himself. And she said, "I'm cold." And he said, "I know. Me too. Let's walk. Walking will warm us up." And they started moving down the street with no destination in mind. Just moving, because standing still felt like giving up. And Daniel carried the duffel bag over one shoulder and held Maya's hand with the other. And they walked past the corner store, where he used to buy her candy on Fridays. Past the park where they'd spent summer afternoons, on the swings. Past the bus stop, where he'd waited every morning to get to his construction job that had ended 2 weeks ago, when the project finished, and the company said they'd call him for the next one, but hadn't called yet. And he realized with a sick feeling that Rebecca had probably been planning this, had probably been waiting for him to be between jobs, to be vulnerable, to have no leverage, and she'd timed her cruelty perfectly, had waited until he had nothing before taking away the last thing he had, which was a roof over his daughter's head. They walked for 20 minutes, maybe 30, and Maya didn't complain, even though Daniel could feel her getting tired, could feel her steps getting slower, and he was about to suggest they stop, about to admit defeat and call the homeless shelter, even though the thought made him want to vomit, when he noticed the neighborhood had changed. The houses had gotten bigger, the yards more manicured, and he realized they'd wandered into the nice part of town, the part where people had money, had security, had lives that looked nothing like his, and he felt even more conspicuous here, felt like an intruder, like someone who would be asked to leave as soon as anyone noticed them. And he was about to turn around, to head back toward the parts of town where they belonged, when Maya said, "Daddy, I need to sit down." And he looked at her face and saw she was pale, exhausted. And he said, "Okay, baby, okay." And he led her to a bench at a small park that sat at the corner of 2 residential streets, surrounded by houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. And they sat down, and Maya immediately curled against his side, and he put his arm around her and tried to shield her from the wind with his body. And they sat there as darkness fell completely, and the streetlights came on, casting everything in that orange sodium glow that made the world look unreal, like a stage set, like none of this was actually happening. Across the street, in one of those magazine houses, a woman named Victoria stood at her kitchen window and watched the man and child on the bench, had been watching them for the past 10 minutes as she prepared dinner she had no appetite for, and she couldn't quite say why they'd caught her attention, couldn't quite articulate what had made her stop mid-motion and stare. Something about the way the man held the child, something about the protective curve of his body, something about the duffel bag at his feet, told her a story she recognized, even though she'd never lived it herself, told her a story about displacement and desperation, and the particular kind of fear that comes from having someone small depending on you when you have nothing left to give. Victoria was 54 years old, had been successful by any external measure, had built a career in commercial real estate that had left her wealthy and respected and completely alone, had bought this house 5 years ago after her second divorce, had filled it with expensive furniture and original art and all the markers of a life well lived, except she didn't live much at all, not really, just moved through the rooms like a ghost, working, sleeping, existing but not connecting, and she'd told herself she preferred it this way, preferred the quiet, preferred not having to negotiate or compromise or care about anyone else's needs, but standing at her window now watching this young man and his daughter, she felt something crack, open in her chest, some door she'd kept carefully locked, and she found herself thinking about what it would mean to open, to let someone in, to do something that mattered beyond another successful deal or another zero in her bank account. She watched as the man stood up, as he tried to coax the child to her feet, watched the child shake her head, watched the man crouch down and speak to her, watched the tenderness in his gestures, and she made a decision that surprised her, even as she made it. Put down the wine glass she'd been holding, grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, and walked out into the November evening that had turned properly cold now. Cold enough that her breath showed white in the air, and she crossed the street with her heart beating harder than it should for such a simple action. And as she got closer, she could see them more clearly. The man was deaf. Young, probably late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that was handsome in a tired, worn way, and the child was small, maybe 5 or 6, with hair in braids that were coming loose and a jacket that was too thin for the weather. And the man saw Victoria approaching, and his whole body went tense, defensive, and he stood and put himself slightly in front of his daughter. And Victoria stopped a few feet away and said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I live across the street. I saw you sitting here, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." And the man said, "We're fine, thank you." And Victoria said, "You don't look fine. You look cold." And the man said, "We're just resting. We'll be moving on soon." And Victoria said, "Where are you moving to?" And the man said, "That's not really your concern." And Victoria said, "You're right, it's not. But I have a large house and several empty bedrooms, and it's going to be below freezing tonight. And I'm offering you a place to get warm. You and your daughter, no strings, no expectations, just basic human decency." Daniel stared at this woman, who'd appeared out of nowhere like something from a dream. This woman, who was clearly wealthy, clearly lived a life completely different from his, and his first instinct was to refuse, was to say no thank you, was to protect his pride even if it meant his daughter froze. But then Maya said, "Daddy, I'm really cold," and her voice was so small, so tired, and he looked down at her and saw she was shivering hard now, and he thought about the shelter with its intake process and questions and the very real possibility to be turned away if they were full. And he thought about sleeping rough with a 5-year-old child, and he looked back at the woman who was waiting patiently, not pushing, just offering. And he said, Why would you do this? We're strangers." And Victoria said, "Because you need help, and I can provide it. Because I have more space than I know what to do with. Because your daughter is cold." And those seemed like sufficient reasons to her, even if they didn't make logical sense. And Daniel said, "I can't pay you." And Victoria said, "I'm not asking you to pay me. I'm asking you to come inside for a few hours, get warm, let your daughter rest, and then you can decide what comes next." And Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to find a reason to refuse. But Maya was tugging on his hand and saying, "Please, Daddy, please." And he was so tired, so completely exhausted, and he found himself nodding, found himself saying, "Okay, just for a few hours." And Victoria said, "Good, follow me." And she led them across the street to her house that looked even bigger up close, with its wide porch and mature trees, and the kind of solid permanence that made Daniel acutely aware of how temporary everything in his life was. Inside the house was warm, blessedly warm, and Maya made a small sound of relief as the heat hit them, and Victoria said, "Let me take your coats." And Daniel helped Maya out of her inadequate jacket and handed it to Victoria, along with his own worn canvas coat. And Victoria hung them carefully on the coat rack, and then led them into the living room, where a gas fireplace was burning. And she said, "Sit, please, make yourselves comfortable." And Daniel sat on the edge of an expensive-looking couch, with Maya pressed against his side, and he looked around at the room that was decorated in creams and soft grays. Everything coordinated, everything expensive, everything speaking to a life he couldn't even imagine. And he felt acutely out of place, felt like he was tracking dirt into somewhere sacred, and Victoria must have seen something in his face because she said, "You're not imposing. I invited you. Please relax." And she disappeared into the kitchen and came back a few minutes later with mugs of hot chocolate for Maya and coffee for Daniel. And Maya took the hot chocolate with both hands, said thank you in the small, polite voice she used with strangers. And Victoria said, "You're very welcome. What's your name?" And Maya said, "Maya." And Victoria said, "That's a beautiful name. I'm Victoria. It's nice to meet you, Maya." And Maya smiled for the first time since they left the apartment, and something in Daniel's chest loosened slightly seeing that smile. Victoria sat in a chair across from them and wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug and said, "I don't want to pry, but are you in trouble? Is there something I should know?" And Daniel said, "No, nothing like that. Just things fell apart. I lost my housing." And Victoria said, "Both of you?" And Daniel said, "Her mother, my ex. She kept the apartment. She didn't want Maya to stay." And Victoria's face did something complicated, some mix of anger and sadness. And she said, "She put you both out." And Daniel said, "She put me out. I took Maya with me." And Victoria said, "Good." And Daniel said, "I know this looks bad. I know what you're thinking." And Victoria said, "What am I thinking?" And Daniel said that I'm a failure, that I can't take care of my kid, that I'm some deadbeat who couldn't keep his life together. And Victoria said, "Actually, I was thinking that you, a father who chose his daughter over shelter, who's trying to protect her, who clearly loves her enough to swallow his pride and accept help from a stranger. And I don't think any of those things make you a failure." And Daniel felt something hot behind his eyes, felt tears threatening. And he looked down at his coffee and said, "I don't know what to do. I don't know what happens next." And Victoria said, "What happens next is you both stay here tonight. You get warm. You get some food. You get some sleep. And tomorrow you can figure out the next step." And Daniel said, "I can ask you to do that." And Victoria said, "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." They talked for another hour, careful conversation, where Daniel explained bits and pieces of his situation. The job loss, the toxic relationship, the complete absence of any safety net. And Victoria listened without judgment, asked questions that were direct but not invasive. And slowly Daniel felt himself relax slightly, felt the immediate panic recede enough that he could think, could plan. And Maya fell asleep against his side, her hot chocolate only half finished, and Victoria said, "She's exhausted. Let me show you to a bedroom. You can put her down properly." And Daniel said, "Are you sure?" And Victoria said, "I'm sure. Follow me." And she led them upstairs to a guest room that was larger than the bedroom he'd shared with Rebecca. A queen bed covered in white linens and its own bathroom. And Daniel laid Maya on the bed and took off her shoes and covered her with the duvet. And she didn't even stir, just burrowed deeper into the warmth. And Victoria said, "There are towels in the bathroom if you want to shower. There's a robe on the back of the door. I can wash your clothes if you'd like." And Daniel said, "You've already done too much." And Victoria said, "I haven't done nearly enough." And she left him alone in the room that smelled like lavender and expensive fabric softener, left him standing there, looking at his daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time. Days, and he felt something break inside him, felt all the fear and shame and exhaustion crash over him at once, and he sat on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands and cried as quietly as he could, cried for everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to protect, everything he didn't know how to fix. Downstairs, Victoria made up the couch in the study as a backup sleeping space in case Daniel didn't want to share the fall bed with his daughter, and she tried not to think too hard about what she was doing, tried not to question the impulse that had made her cross the street, the instinct that had made her open her home to strangers, because if she thought about it too much, she'd realize how foolish it was, how risky, how completely unlike her usual careful, controlled life, and she'd convince herself to ask them to leave, to call a shelter, to pass the responsibility to someone else. But something about that young man's face, something about the way he'd held his daughter, something about the desperation mixed with dignity had spoken to something in Victoria that she'd thought was dead, some capacity for spontaneous compassion, some willingness to be inconvenienced, some need to matter to someone even in this small temporary way. She'd been married twice. Once in her 20s to a man who'd wanted a wife who stayed home and produced children, and once in her 40s to a man who'd wanted a wife who looked good at business functions and didn't ask questions about his affairs. And neither marriage had given her children. The first because she'd miscarried 3 times, and eventually her husband had left her for someone more fertile. And the second because she'd been too old and too tired and too aware that bringing a child into that particular dysfunction would be cruel, and she'd made her peace with childlessness, or told herself she had built a life that was full in other ways, full of work and travel and expensive hobbies, but watching that little girl sleep upstairs, watching the fierce protective love in her father's eyes, Victoria felt the ghost of all those unmade lives, all those children she'd never had, all those chances for connection she'd let slip away. Daniel came downstairs around 9, hair wet from the shower, wearing the robe Victoria had mentioned. And he said, "Maya's still asleep. She didn't even wake up when I moved her." And Victoria said, "That's good. She needs rest." And Daniel said, "I need to thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough for this." And Victoria said, "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." And Daniel said most people would. Tav, most people would have walked past. And Victoria said most people are scared. Scared of getting involved? Scared of being inconvenienced? Scared of seeing themselves in other people's disasters? And Daniel said, "And you're not scared?" And Victoria said, "Oh, I'm terrified. I just decided to do it anyway." And Daniel laughed, a real laugh that surprised both of them. And he said, "I like that. I like the honesty." And Victoria said, "I figure there's no point in pretending. Life's too short for performance." And Daniel said, "I wish more people felt that way." And Victoria said, "Me too." And they sat in the kitchen, talked while Victoria made tea, and Daniel told her about Maya, about how she was smart and funny and brave, about how she loved dinosaurs and refused to wear dresses, about how she'd been so understanding. Through all the chaos, never complained, never threw tantrums. Just tried to be good, tried to be easy, and Victoria heard in his words how much he loved this child, how she was the center of his universe, and she thought about how rare that was. How many parents treated their children like burdens or accessories? And here was this young man who'd literally chosen homelessness over leaving his daughter behind. The next morning arrived cold and bright, sun streaming through the kitchen windows where Victoria was making breakfast, and Maya appeared in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and she said, "Where's my daddy?" And Victoria said, "He's still sleeping. He was very tired. How did you sleep?" And Maya said, "Good, that bed is really soft." And Victoria said, "I'm glad." "You hungry?" And Maya nodded. And Victoria said, "What do you like for breakfast?" And Maya said, "Anything. I'm not picky." And Victoria said, Everyone's picky about something. What's your favorite? And Maya thought about it seriously and said pancakes with chocolate chips. And Victoria said, I think I can manage that. Do you want to help? And Maya's face lit up and she said yes. And they made pancakes together, Maya standing on a stool to reach the counter, carefully measuring ingredients while Victoria guided her. And it was peaceful and domestic, and reminded Victoria of the life she'd imagined having once, before miscarriages and divorces had rerouted everything. And Maya said, you have a really nice house. And Victoria said, thank you. And Maya said, do you live here all alone? And Victoria said, yes, just me. And Maya said, doesn't that get lonely? And Victoria said, sometimes. And Maya said, you should get a cat. Cats are good company. My friend Emma has a cat, and it's really nice. And Victoria said, maybe I will get a cat. That's a good idea. And Maya said, or we could stay here and keep you company. And Victoria felt something catch in her throat. And she said, we'll see, sweetheart. We'll see. Daniel came downstairs to find his daughter and this stranger who'd taken them in laughing together over pancakes. Flour on both their noses, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching Maya be a kid, be light and easy and happy in a way she hadn't been in months. And Victoria looked up and saw him and said, good morning. We made pancakes. There's plenty if you want some. And Daniel said, good morning. Thank you. And he joined them at the kitchen island and ate pancakes that were the best thing he'd tasted in recent memory. And Maya chattered about helping cook, about how Victoria had shown her how to flip them, about how she'd only dropped one on the floor. And Daniel felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. Felt like maybe things weren't completely hopeless. Maybe they'd catch a break. Maybe everything would work out somehow. After breakfast, Victoria said she needed to go into the office for a few hours. Said they were welcome to stay, to rest, to use whatever they needed. Daniel said we should probably go. We've imposed enough. And Victoria said, where will you go? And Daniel said, I'll figure something out. And Victoria said, Daniel, be realistic. It's Saturday. Most services are closed or limited. Have no money, no transportation, nowhere to go. Stay here at least through the weekend. Give yourself time to make a plan that doesn't involve sleeping in a park. And Daniel said, I don't want to take advantage. And Victoria said, you're not taking advantage. I'm offering. There's a difference. And besides, Maya seems happy here. And Daniel looked at his daughter, who was nodding enthusiastically, and he said, okay, through the weekend. But I'm going to figure out next steps. I'm not going to freeload. And Victoria said, I know you are not. And she gathered her things and left them in her house, trusted them, alone with all her expensive possessions. And Daniel felt the weight of that trust, felt how much it meant that someone believed he wasn't going to rob her or destroy things, believed he was decent, even though she barely knew him. Victoria returned around 2 p.m. with bags of groceries and clothes from a department store. And she said, I hope you don't mind. I picked up some things for Maya, just basics, a few outfits and a warmer coat. And Daniel said you didn't have to do that. And Victoria said, I know I didn't have to. I wanted to. And Maya was already digging through the bags, pulling out a purple jacket and soft pants and shirts with dinosaurs on them. And she said, these are perfect. Thank you, Victoria. And she threw her arms around Victoria's waist, and Victoria froze for a second, surprised, and then carefully hugged her back, and Daniel saw tears in Victoria's eyes before she blinked them away, and he understood suddenly that this wasn't just about helping them. This was about Victoria needing to help, needing to feel useful, needing to matter to someone, and he realized they might be giving her something too, might be filling some void in her too quiet life, and he felt less guilty about accepting her help, knowing it wasn't completely one-sided. They spent the afternoon together, the three of them, watching movies in Victoria's home theater room. Maya sat between them on the couch, and it felt almost normal, almost like a family, and Daniel tried not to let himself get comfortable with the feeling, tried not to let himself imagine this could be more than temporary, but it was hard not to enjoy the warmth and safety, hard not to notice how good Victoria was with Maya, how patient, how kind, hard not to notice Victoria herself, the way she moved, the way she laughed, the sharp intelligence in her eyes. And he thought about the age difference, about the gap between her established life and his disaster of one. And he pushed those thoughts away because they were ridiculous, because she was just being kind, just helping out someone in trouble, nothing more. Sunday morning, Victoria made waffles and asked Daniel what his plan was. And he said, "I've been thinking about it. There's a shelter across town. They have a family section. I can go there tomorrow. Get us on a list for transitional housing?" And Victoria said, "And in the meantime." And Daniel said, "In the meantime, I guess we stay at the shelter. They have beds, meals. It's not ideal, but it's something." And Victoria said, "Or you could stay here a bit longer. Give yourself time to actually stabilize, to look for work, to save some money." And Daniel said, "Victoria, we can't stay here indefinitely." And Victoria said, "I'm not suggesting indefinitely. I'm suggesting a few weeks, maybe a month, just until you get on your feet." And Daniel said, "Why would you do that? What's in it for you?" And Victoria said, "Maybe I like the company. Maybe this house feels less empty with people in it. Maybe I want to help. Is that so?" Hard to believe. And Daniel said honestly, "Yes, most people don't help without wanting something back." And Victoria said, "Most people aren't me." And she said it without arrogance, just as fact. And Daniel said, "I'd need to contribute somehow. I can't just live here for free." And Victoria said, "You can help with household things, repairs, maintenance, whatever needs doing. I've been putting off projects for months." And Daniel said, "Okay, but just until I find work, just until I can afford a place for us." And Victoria said agreed, and they shook on it like a business deal, both of them pretending it was just practical, just logical, both of them ignoring the way Maya was grinning like she'd won the lottery. The first week passed in a strange domesticity. Daniel fixed the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom and repaired the loose railing on the back deck and cleaned out the gutters. And Maya started calling the guest room and arranging her new stuffed animals on the bed. And Victoria came home from work each evening to a house that felt lived in for the first time since she'd bought it. Came home to Maya's drawings on the refrigerator, and Daniel's boots by the door, and the smell of whatever simple dinner he'd managed to make with her groceries. And she realized she liked it, liked coming home to people, liked having someone to talk to about her day, liked hearing Maya stories about the educational videos she watched, or the books Daniel read to her, and she thought about how quickly you could get used to not being alone, how dangerous that was, how much it would hurt when they inevitably left. The neighbors noticed, of course they noticed the man and child coming and going from Victoria's house, noticed Victoria smiling more, noticed the changes, and the gossip started almost immediately, spread through the small community like wildfire. Victoria Winters has taken in a young man and his child. Victoria Winters is playing house with someone half her age. What is she thinking? Doesn't she realize how it looks? And Constance Morrison, who lived 3 doors down, made it her personal mission to find out what was going on. Knocked on Victoria's door one evening, under the pretense of borrowing sugar, and her eyes went wide when Daniel answered, when she saw this handsome young man in bare feet looking comfortable and at home. And she said, "Oh, I was looking for Victoria." And Daniel said the upstairs, helping Maya with a bath. "Can I help you with something?" And Constance said, No, I'll come back later." And she practically ran back to her house to call everyone she knew. By the end of the second week, the whole neighborhood knew Victoria had taken in a young man and his daughter, and the speculation was rampant. Some people thought it was charity, thought Victoria was doing a good deed. Others thought it was something more scandalous, thought Victoria had lost her mind, was having some kind of crisis, was being taken advantage of by a con artist who'd figured out how to manipulate her. And the judgment came in looks and whispers, and the sudden coldness when Victoria went to the community market, and she felt it, felt the weight of their disapproval. But she'd lived through worse, had survived 2 divorces and business deals that went bad, and parents who'd never approved of her choices. And she wasn't about to let small-minded neighbors dictate her life now. Daniel felt it too. Felt the stares when he went to the hardware store to get supplies for his projects. Felt the suspicion, heard the whispers, and he hated it. Hated that his presence was making Victoria's life harder. Hated that people assumed the worst. Assumed he was using her, and he said, "Maybe we should go. Maybe this isn't worth the trouble we're causing you." And Victoria said, "The only trouble is other people's nosiness, and I've never particularly cared what they think." And Daniel said, "Still, I don't want to make your life difficult." And Victoria said, "My life was difficult before you got here, just in a different way. It was quiet and empty and pointless, and now it has noise and purpose, and that's worth some gossip." And Daniel said, "Are you sure?" And Victoria said, "I'm sure." Maya celebrated her 6th birthday in Victoria's house, and Victoria threw her a small party, invited a few children from the neighborhood, whose parents reluctantly agreed to let them come, and she bought a cake from the expensive bakery and decorations with dinosaurs all over them. And Maya's face when she saw it all was worth every penny, worth every judgmental look, worth everything. And Maya said, "This is the best birthday I've ever had." And Daniel said, "Better than last year when we went to the bounce place." Maya said, "Way better, because this feels like home." And Daniel and Victoria both went quiet, both absorbed the weight of that word, home. And after the party, when Maya was asleep, Daniel and Victoria sat on the back porch with wine. And Daniel said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us." And Victoria said, "You've thanked me plenty." And Daniel said, "Not enough. Never enough. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us dignity. You treated us like we mattered." And Victoria said, "You do matter." And Daniel said, "I'm starting to believe that." And Victoria said, "Good." There was a long silence, comfortable but charged. And Daniel said, "Can I ask you something?" And Victoria said, "Anything." And Daniel said, "Why are you really doing this? I don't buy that it's just about company or having someone to fix your house. There's something else." And Victoria was quiet for a long time. And finally, she said, "I had 3 miscarriages in my 20s, wanted children desperately, and it never happened. And my first husband left me because of it, said I was broken. And I spent years believing that, believing I was fundamentally flawed, and I built this life that looked successful on the outside but felt empty on the inside. And then I saw you with Maya, saw how much you loved her, how you'd sacrificed everything for her. And I wanted to be part of that somehow, wanted to matter to someone the way you matter to her." And Daniel said, "You matter to us, to both of us, more than you know." And Victoria said, "I'm starting to believe that too." The 3rd week Rebecca showed up, Daniel's ex. She'd somehow found out where they were staying, probably through mutual acquaintances, probably through the gossip network that seemed to know everything. And she knocked on the Door mid-morning, when Daniel was alone, Victoria at work, and Maya at an enrichment program Victoria had enrolled her in, and Daniel opened the door to find Rebecca standing there looking angry and beautiful and familiar in a way that made his stomach hurt. And she said, "So, this is where you've been hiding." And Daniel said, "I'm not hiding." And Rebecca said, "Shacking up with some rich woman. Nice work. Didn't think you had it in you." And Daniel said, "It's not like that." And Rebecca said, "Then what's it like? Explain to me what's going on here." And Daniel said, "She's helping us. That's all. She gave us a place to stay when we had nowhere to go." And Rebecca said, "And what does she get in return?" And Daniel said, "Nothing. She's just being kind." And Rebecca laughed that cruel laugh he remembered too well. And she said, "Nobody's just kind. Everyone wants something." And Daniel said, "Not everyone. It's like you, Rebecca. Not everyone has an angle." And Rebecca's face hardened, and she said, "I want Maya back." And Daniel said, "What?" And Rebecca said, "I want my daughter back. You had no right to take her." And Daniel said, "You told me to take her. You said you didn't care." And Rebecca said, "I was angry. I didn't mean it. And besides, this isn't a suitable living situation. You're not even on the lease. You're squatting in some woman's house. And I could call child services, could tell them you're homeless." And Daniel felt ice in his veins, felt real fear, and he said, "You wouldn't." And Rebecca said, "Try me." And just then, Victoria's car pulled into the driveway. Victoria saw the woman standing on her porch, saw Daniel's face, saw the tension, and she got out of the car and walked up the steps and said, "Hello. I'm Victoria Winters. You must be Rebecca." And Rebecca looked Victoria up and down, taking in the expensive clothes, the confident bearing, the undeniable presence. And she said, "So you're the woman who's playing house with my family." And Victoria said, "I'm the woman who gave them shelter when they had none." And Rebecca said, "How noble of you." And Victoria said, "Daniel told me you put them out. Told me you said you didn't want Maya." And Rebecca said, "He's a liar." And Victoria said, "I don't think he is. I think he's honest to a fault. I think you're the one who lying." And Rebecca said, "You don't know anything about our situation." And Victoria said, "I know enough. I know a mother who truly wanted her daughter wouldn't have let her leave in the first place. And I know you're only here now because you heard Daniel landed on his feet, because you can't stand the thought of him being okay without you." And Rebecca said, "That's ridiculous." And Victoria said, "Is it? Because it seems pretty obvious to me." And Rebecca said, "I could make trouble for you. I have connections. I could tell people what's really going on here." And Victoria stepped closer, and when she spoke, her voice was cold and hard. And she said, "I've built a career on dealing with people who try to intimidate me, and I promise you, you're not nearly as scary as you think you are. Now get off my property before I call the police." And Rebecca looked between Victoria and Daniel, seemed to realize she'd lost this round. And she said, "This isn't over." And she left, and Daniel let out a breath he'd been holding. And he said, "I'm sorry." And Victoria said, "You have nothing to apologize for." And Daniel said, "She's going to make trouble." And Victoria said, "Let her try. I've dealt with worse." That evening, when Maya came home, Daniel sat her down and explained that her mother had visited, that her mother said she wanted Maya back. And Maya's face went very still, very careful. And she said, "I don't want to go back." And Daniel said, "I know, baby." And Maya said she was always mean, always yelling. And you weren't there all the time because you were working. And I was scared. And Daniel felt like he'd been punched. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And Maya said, "I didn't want to make you sad." And Daniel pulled her into his arms and said, "You can always tell me things. Always. Even if they make me sad. Especially if they make you scared." And Maya said, "I like it here. I like Victoria. I don't want to leave." And Daniel said, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we don't have to leave. I promise. And Victoria, who'd been standing in the doorway, listening, said, we'll figure this out, all of us together. And Maya said okay, and she seemed to accept this, seemed to trust that the adults would handle things. And Daniel wished he had that kind of faith. Wished he believed things would work out, but he'd seen too much of how the system worked. Knew that biological mothers had rights, knew that his precarious housing situation could be used against him, knew that Rebecca could make things very difficult if she wanted to. Victoria called her lawyer the next morning, a woman named Patricia, who'd handled both her divorces and numerous business deals, and she explained the situation. And Patricia said honestly, it's complicated. Daniel has no formal custody agreement. Rebecca could claim abandonment if she wanted to. But the fact that she told him to take Maya, that there are probably witnesses to her neglect, that helps. And Victoria said, what can we do? And Patricia said, document everything. Get statements from anyone who saw Rebecca's behavior. Build a case that Daniel is the stable parent, the primary caregiver, and if possible, get Rebecca to admit in writing that she gave up custody voluntarily. And Victoria said, thank you. And Patricia said, Victoria, can I ask what your involvement is here? And Victoria said, I'm helping them. And Patricia said, that's clear. But what's the nature of your relationship with Daniel? And Victoria said, he's staying in my house temporarily while he gets back on his feet. And Patricia said, and is there anything more than that? Victoria said, no, why does it matter? And Patricia said, because if Rebecca's lawyer tries to paint this as an inappropriate relationship, as Daniel using you, it could hurt his case, could make him look unstable or opportunistic. And Victoria said, that's absurd. And Patricia said, I agree, but that doesn't mean it won. It happen, so be careful. Keep things appropriate, and make sure there's no room for misinterpretation. And Victoria said okay, and hung up feeling frustrated, because the idea that two adults couldn't help each other without it being sexual was depressing, was indicative of how cynical the world had become. Daniel found work, finally, a construction company that was starting a new project. And he came home that evening with the news, and Victoria could see the relief and pride in his face, see him standing a little straighter, and he said, I start Monday, it's good pay, union job, I'll be able to save, to get us our own place. And Victoria said, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. And Daniel said, I couldn't have done this without you, without the stability you gave us. I was too scattered, too panicked, to even look properly before. And Victoria said, you'd have figured it out eventually. And Daniel said, maybe, or maybe we'd have ended up in a shelter, in the system. Who knows? And he paused and said, I want to pay rent. I know you said I didn't have to, but I want to contribute, want to pay my way. And Victoria said, okay. If it makes you feel better, we can work something out, something reasonable. And Daniel said, thank you. And there was a moment where they just looked at each other, and something passed between them. Some recognition, some acknowledgement of what was building between them, even though neither of them was ready to name it. And then Maya ran in demanding dinner, and the moment passed, but didn't disappear, just settled into the background, waiting. The neighborhood association meeting happened on a Thursday evening, one of those required gatherings where residents discussed community issues. And Victoria almost didn't go, but Constance Morrison had been making pointed comments about certain situations that needed to be addressed. And Victoria was about to let them talk about her behind her back. Wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of thinking they'd chased her away. So she went, and Daniel insisted on coming with her, and they walked into the community center together and felt every eye turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity, and Constance called the meeting to order and went through the 19 usual business, landscaping and parking and neighborhood watch, and then she said there's been some concern raised about housing arrangements, about people living in homes they don't own, about situations that might be uncomfortable for the community. And Victoria stood up and said, "If you have something to say, Constance, say it directly." And Constance said, "Fine. There's concern about your house guest, about whether it's appropriate, about whether it sets a good example." And Victoria said, "What exactly isn't appropriate? The fact that I offered shelter to a man and his child who had nowhere else to go, the fact that I chose human decency over preserving appearances. Please explain what's inappropriate about that." And Constance said, "It's just unusual. That's all. People are talking." And Victoria said, "Let them talk. I've survived worse than gossip. And besides, what I do in my own home is no one's business but mine." And several people in the room nodded, and someone else said, "I think what Victoria did was admirable. We should all be so generous." And Constance looked flustered and said, "I'm just expressing community concern." And Daniel stood then and said, "I appreciate the concern, but I want to be clear. I'm not taking advantage of Victoria. I'm working. I'm paying rent. I'm a temporary resident who's trying to get back on his feet. And I'd think a community would support that rather than judge it." And more people nodded. And Constance realized she was losing the room, and she moved on to other business. But Victoria caught Daniel's hand under the table and squeezed it, and he squeezed back, and they sat there in the fluorescent-lit community center, feeling like maybe they'd won something small but important. Rebecca filed for custody. Official papers served to Daniel at Victoria's house, and he read them with shaking hands. Read how Rebecca claimed she was a stable single mother, how Daniel was essentially homeless, living off the charity of strangers, how the living situation was inappropriate and potentially harmful to Maya, and he wanted to punch something, wanted to scream. But Maya was in the next room and he couldn't fall apart, couldn't show fear. So he called Patricia, Victoria, lawyer who'd agreed to represent him pro bono as a favor to Victoria. And Patricia said, "We'll fight this. We have good grounds. But I need you to be honest with me about your relationship with Victoria." And Daniel said, "We're friends. She's helping me, that's all." And Patricia said, "Are you attracted to her?" And Daniel said, "What does that have to do with anything?" And Patricia said, "Because if you are, if there's any possibility of something more, Rebecca's lawyer will use that, will paint you as unstable, as distracted, as putting your love life ahead of your daughter." And Daniel said, "There's nothing like that happening." And Patricia said, "But do you want there to be?" And Daniel was quiet because he didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to explain that yes, he was attracted to Victoria. How could he not be? She was beautiful and smart and kind, but more than that, he respected her, admired her, felt safe with her in a way he'd never felt with anyone. And he wanted to explore that, wanted to see where it could go, but he couldn't, not now, not when Maya's future hung in the balance. And he said, "No, there's nothing like that." And Patricia said, "Okay, then we'll proceed on the basis that this is a temporary housing arrangement, nothing more." and we'll show that you're a stable, employed parent who's doing everything right." And Daniel said okay, and hung up feeling like he'd just lied under oath, even though technically he'd told the truth. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and in that time, Daniel threw himself into being the perfect father, documented everything, kept detailed notes of Maya's routines, her happiness, her progress, took photos and videos of their life, and Victoria helped, provided character references, opened her home to the social worker, who came to inspect, answered every question with calm professionalism, and the social worker, a tired woman named Janet who'd probably seen every variation of family dysfunction, walked through the house and interviewed Maya, and talked to Daniel and Victoria separately. And at the end she said, "This seems like a good environment. Stable, loving." And Daniel said, "So you'll recommend Maya stay with me?" And Janet said, "I'll recommend what's best for the child. And that requires looking at both environments. But I'll say you've made a compelling case." And that was the best they could hope for. And when she left, Daniel collapsed on the couch and said, "I can't lose her. I can't." And Victoria sat next to him and said, "You won't. We won't let that happen." And Daniel said, "You keep saying we, like you're part of this." And Victoria said, "I am part of this. Whether you like it or not, I care about Maya. I care about you, and I'm not going anywhere." And Daniel turned to look at her and said, Why do you care so much?" And Victoria said, "Because you gave me something I didn't know I needed. You reminded me what it feels like to matter, to be necessary, and I'm not ready to give that up." And Daniel said, "Even though it's complicated, even though people judge." And Victoria said, "Especially because of that." And they sat there close enough to touch, but not touching, both of them aware of the line they weren't crossing. Both of them aware that crossing it would change everything. The day before the hearing, Rebecca called, and Daniel almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up, and she said, "I'll drop the custody case if you give me money, $20,000, and I'll sign over full custody." And Daniel said, "I don't have that kind of money." And Rebecca said, "Your rich girlfriend does." And Daniel said, "She's not my girlfriend." And Rebecca said, "Whatever. She is. I know she has money. I looked her up. She's worth millions. 20,000 is nothing to her." And Daniel said, "I'm not asking her for money." And Rebecca said, "Then I'll see you in court, and I'll tell them about how you abandoned us, how you left us with nothing, and I'll get Maya back, and you'll be lucky to get supervised visitation." And she hung up, and Daniel sat there feeling sick, feeling trapped. And when Victoria came home, he told her about the call. And Victoria said, "I'll pay it." And Daniel said, "Absolutely not." And Victoria said, "Daniel, if it solves the problem." And Daniel said, "It's extortion. And more than that, I won't let you buy my daughter. Won't let you think you have to pay for us to stay." And Victoria said, "That's not what I am doing." And Daniel said, "Isn't it? Isn't that what this becomes if you pay her? You become the benefactor, the savior, the one we're indebted to. And I can't live like that. Can't build a life on that foundation." And Victoria said, "So what do we do?" And Daniel said, "We go to court, we fight, and we trust that the truth matters," even though he wasn't sure he believed that himself. The courthouse was cold and impersonal, all marble and fluorescent lights, and the smell of floor cleaner. And Daniel sat at the defendant's table with Patricia beside him, while Rebecca sat across the aisle with her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, who probably charged more per hour than Daniel made. In a week, and the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, listened to both sides present their cases, and Rebecca's lawyer painted a picture of Daniel as an unfit father, essentially homeless, living off a woman he barely knew, unstable employment history, no formal custody arrangement. And Patricia countered with Daniel's employment, his dedication to Maya, the statements from teachers and doctors and neighbors who'd seen him with Maya, who'd witnessed his love and commitment. And Victoria testified, answered questions about the living arrangement, confirmed it was temporary, confirmed Daniel paid rent, confirmed there was nothing inappropriate about the situation, and the judge listened and made notes and asked her own questions. And when everyone had spoken, she said she'd review the evidence and issue a decision within a week, and they left the courthouse in silence, Daniel feeling like he'd just run a marathon, feeling wrung out and terrified. And Victoria drove them home and made tea, and they sat in the kitchen not talking because there was nothing to say, nothing but wait. And Maya came home from school and asked if everything was okay. And Daniel said yes, everything's fine, because what else could he say? He couldn't burden her with his fear, couldn't let her see how close he was to falling apart. The decision came 6 days later. A phone call from Patricia, and Daniel answered with his heart hammering. And Patricia said, "You got full custody. The judge ruled in your favor, cited your stability, your employment, your clear commitment to Maya. And she noted that Rebecca had failed to maintain contact or show interest until it became convenient. And Daniel said, we won. And Patricia said, you won. And Daniel said, thank you. Thank you so much. And Patricia said, thank Victoria. She made this possible. And Daniel hung up and found Victoria in the garden where she was pulling weeds. And he said, we won. I have full custody. And Victoria stood up and brushed dirt from her hands and said, that's wonderful. I am so happy for you. And Daniel said for us, I'm happy for us. And Victoria said us, and Daniel said yes, us, because that's what we are, it, we're an us. And Victoria said, Daniel, you just won custody. You, free to leave, to get your own place, to start over. And Daniel said, I don't want to leave. I want to stay, want to be here with you. And Victoria said, you don't know what you're saying. You're grateful. That's all. And Daniel said, I'm grateful. And I'm in love with you. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. And Victoria went very still. And she said, you can't be. I'm too old. You're too young. And Daniel said, you're 54, and I'm 26. That's a gap, but not an impossible one. And Victoria said, people will judge. People already judge. And Daniel said, let them. I don't care. I care about you, about us, about building something real. And Victoria said, what about Maya? What if she doesn't want this? And Daniel said, Maya already wants this. She's been asking when you're going to be her mom for weeks now. And Victoria laughed and cried the same time. And she said, this is crazy. And Daniel said, probably, but let's be crazy together. And he kissed her there in the garden with dirt under their fingernails, and the late afternoon sun turning everything gold. And Victoria kissed him back and thought about all the rules she was breaking, all the judgments she was inviting, all the ways could go wrong. And she decided she didn't care, decided that this connection, this family they were building, was worth any price. They told Maya that evening, sat her down in the living room, and Daniel said, we have some news. And Maya said, "Is Victoria leaving?" And Daniel said, "No, the opposite. We're staying. All of us, together." And Maya said, "Like a family." And Victoria said, "Yes, like a family, if that's okay with you." And Maya threw herself at Victoria and said, "Yes, yes, yes. I've been wishing for this." And Victoria held her and looked at Daniel over Maya's head, and they both had tears in their eyes. And later that night, after Maya was asleep, Daniel and Victoria sat on the porch and talked about logistics, about how they'd make this work, about telling people, about merging their lives officially. And Victoria said, "People are going to talk, going to say terrible things." And Daniel said, "I know." And Victoria said, "Are you sure you're ready for that?" And Daniel said, "I've been homeless. I've been judged. I've been called a failure. Whatever they say can't be worse than what I've already survived. And besides, I'll have you. We'll have each other." And Victoria said, "Yes, we will." And they sat there in the quiet night, in the mall house that had become home, and thought about the future, about all the small moments that would fill it. Maya's birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays, all of it mattering, because they'd chosen each other, chosen this unconventional, beautiful, complicated family they were building. And Daniel looked at Victoria and thought about how sometimes the worst moments of your life lead directly to the best ones. How being kicked out onto that cold sidewalk had led him here, to this woman, to this home, to this future he never imagined, but that felt more right than anything he'd ever planned. And Victoria looked at Daniel and thought about how emptiness could be filled if you were brave enough to open the door, brave enough to let people in, brave enough to believe that love didn't have an expiration date, didn't follow a schedule, just showed up when it was ready and changed everything. And they sat there together as the stars came out one by one above them, each star a possibility, each moment a gift, each day ahead an adventure they'd face together, the three of them. The family nobody expected. The family that shouldn't have worked, but did. The family built on kindness and courage and the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear.